Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 11th episode of Retuning Your Firm, which, as those of you who haven't been on it before, is all looking at what are the things that management can do, leadership can do to prepare their firm. And we're now in a sort of 6-month limbo, maybe you should think of it that way, in terms of the working from home, which, as we found out last week, actually hasn't had a huge financial impact, but it'll have lots of other consequences. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the show today. And I hope that some of you had the chance to try out some informal networking in Remo. We had a conference last week and it was incredibly successful. I think 80 or 90 people came in. The conference went on for 8 hours. And at the end of that 8 hours, 80% of the people were still in there. They've been there all day for 8 hours online. I don't think that will be possible in Zoom. I hope they don't censor me for saying that. But, Remo really gives you a lot of energy and fun. So if you haven't tried it this week, do try it next. So what are we talking about today? What are today's themes? There are three. We're going to be looking at sector trends. If you recall, every month we look at sector and what's going on, and that is something that government finds particularly interesting. We're looking at a very interesting area of the board CEO collaboration. The idea that the CEO can just go off and do what they want. Well, maybe they've got a bit more latitude in the current climate, but most people will have a board that make sure that they are at least going what seems to be a sensible direction. And the last one is the rather nice imagery here: resilience and strength. And what is it that you can do as a leader, both for yourself but also for your people? How can you do that? So great panel as always. First of all, Andrew Kakabadse, one of, I think I'm fair to say, one of the UK's foremost thinkers. Been at Henley Business School, prior to that was at Cranfield, Professor of Governance and Leadership. Monitors something like 14,000 boards, I believe, so really has a good understanding of that world. Does a lot of work also around central government arrangements too. Dan TorjussonProctor, who was formerly the MD membership for UK Finance, and prior to that City UK, knows a lot about financial services world, very much more regulated environment. So other lessons that we can learn from a regulated world that will help us as leaders of professional firms. Neville Eisenberg, 15 years managing partner of law firm Berwin Leighton Payson, get it right, and now BCLP. Well, it's funny how you quickly shift from one to the other. He's now the chief executive of one of the new businesses called BCLP Cubed, which, if you may recall, for our awards back in March, was the winner, which was amazing. So congratulations on that. And who else but Francesca, our anchor tenant. Lovely to have you as always. 26 weeks in, if you think about the Sharing Challenges series. She hasn't missed one of them, but she just told me she's going to be off in 2 weeks' time, so that's a real shame. But onwards and upwards, we'll manage somehow, Francesca, I'm sure. And of course, yours truly, founder, chief executive, and managing partners forum. So that's today's panel, and I'm really looking forward to their thoughts. For those of you who haven't been on the show before, each of the top two panel members will be giving about a 5-minute presentation on their theme. If you recall, that was the whole issue of board and leadership for Andrew, and looking at resilience for Dan. And then what we'll then do is we'll move to a panel session with Neville and Francesca, who have both obviously been on the show before, coming in, and we'll kind of see really where the conversation takes us. Last week we talked about sport, we talked about a lot of other interesting areas. Today I'm sure we'll go in a completely different direction, but obviously it's great to have everybody on the call today. So what am I going to just give you? These are my quick 7 strategies. Again, you may have seen them before, but I still think they're worth just reiterating quickly. As Lewis Carroll said, believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. If you're not using your imagination, then you're not really helping your firm. Think big. Remember that you are the power of your relationships, and that really involves reciprocity. It's not much good having a phone book. You've actually got to remember who those people are and really make sure you're thinking of them. But think small. Think about the angles that will resonate with your key audiences. Everybody's being resonated. Why should anybody come on yet another Zoom call? Because there's something in it that's interesting, and we're great. It's great that 26 weeks in, we've still got great audiences for today. Think about campaigns, saying with the same point, that converts your audience into a community. Go out, think about how you can engage your clients around that sort of issue, and your people as well. Think about new ideas and services, some conventional things. Most people will have not, if not reinvented their business model, at least looked at their strategy in a lot of depth. Speed is of the essence, but speed, doing things sensibly. In other words, you've got to articulate your assumptions. Any accountant will tell you if you change the assumptions, you can change the profit numbers. So again, thinking same in strategy, think about what you're articulating and then market test them. And if they prove invalid, and some will, then you amend them and you pivot in a new direction. And that kind of depersonalizes it. All too often, people on the board kind of say, oh, that's my strategy, and get very personal. This begins to take away some of that aspect. And be entrepreneurial. This show didn't exist 6 months ago, well, 7 months ago. But keep listening and innovating. And I always say the most important word in that sentence is listening. If you're not listening to your clients, how can you be sure you're giving them the services that they need? So that's a pretty fundamental area. So thank you very much to Elena Kudzko of Globsec for that wonderful insight, going back to April and still completely relevant, which I think is really amazing. So let's have a look. What happened last week? Well, we looked here at the impact of people continuing to work from home. And as you'll see here, there were 3 areas that I looked at from the firm's perspective: the whole issue of client service, profitability, and business development. And obviously Dan, with his business development perspective, will have views on this, I'm sure, when we get to talk about it. But what's the view that comes out of this? Well, profitability, not that affected. It's modest, and the same with client service. But when it comes to business development, that's getting more challenging, with 70% saying it's either material or significantly more difficult to engage in business development. So that possibly doesn't surprise you, but that's the feedback on that one. In terms of how people feel, do they feel more energetic? Yep. Do they feel more productive? For sure. Or do they feel less stressed? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in terms of resilience. The one that's possibly stands out a little bit more is the one around stress. In other words, that people are absolutely, if you like, feeling a little bit more less stressed because they're actually working from home compared with working in an office. And the third group that we had was more around the activities. Are you being a better spouse or partner? In other words, are you helping with the chores? Are you taking more exercise? Are you eating more healthily because you're not just rushing out for the usual pret? And are you taking more breaks? And guess what? The one that's probably getting least attention is the breaks. In other words, people just seem to be working constantly. And as the physiologist will tell us, that's not necessarily a very good place to be. So that's the feedback from last week. So that's great. And as you probably gathered, the government have really appreciates these polls that we're doing. This is the feedback we had. Your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times, which I didn't ask for that. That was unprompted feedback, and I really appreciate that feedback was given to us. So let's move on to today's poll. As I probably mentioned before, it's our monthly tracker. Okay, I'll go through them now and let people know which ones are the highest. Increasing operational efficiency remains the most popular item in terms of business priorities. A clear purpose and strategy remains very high. People skills remains high. To me, there's no material changes in business priorities over the past month. So that's interesting itself. In terms of level of dip in firms' income, again, we've got a few people who are more than 30, but the bulk are in the none to 10%, which again coincides with more or less what we have seen in prior months. In terms of the expanding or contracting the level of activity, very much the same, modest contraction. Some more people on expansion than last month. Maybe there was a particularly not very interesting month, but the ratio of expansion to contraction has changed materially in the past month. So possibly people were feeling even less positive a month ago than now. And in terms of new workflow, again, that looks like the expansion is actually slightly more than the contraction, which takes us back to where we were at the end of July. So maybe the end of August was an interesting month. Everybody was a bit unsure. Maybe they've settled down now. In terms of, do they expect to expand or contract the headcount? Again, headcount is still looking at being overall contraction, but it's modest, and there is still some expansion, but it's again not very great. In terms of what's going to happen, and this is a slightly new question from the one that we ran last month, when I think I was looking at what's happening in December. Now clearly the government has made that decision for us. So what's happening now is what proportion of people are likely to be working from. I put after the pandemic has eased. I'm not going to try and define eased. I think we kind of know what that means. And the number of people who say that everybody will be back in the office is a mere 4%. That's about the same as before. Everybody staying from home, a little bit less, 14%, around half 43. So it's sort of not that different. So what was expected to be at December is moving into more of a permanent. Does that therefore have impact on the changes in office space after the pandemic's eased? And again, as we'll see, there's a big chunk of saying about the same, probably because of social distancing means that you need more space. Nobody's going for more space. I suspect that's kind of nothing new there. And then you've got a fair chunk, 40-odd%, who are looking for less space. And as we've seen before, it's either kind of 10% or 30%, not much in between. In terms of what are the constraints? Well, again, this tends to be something that what are the constraints that are most preventing your firm from achieving optimal performance? The one that has traditionally come from nowhere over the past 6 months, financial health of your client base. I don't think I would have even included it in the one we did back in February, which was Boris Bant's territory. You may vaguely remember that. But the poor economic outlook and the financial health of the client base are just very, very strong issues. And they're ones that are clearly people seeing as ones that are going to stop them achieving I call it their optimal performance. I wasn't trying to define that. In terms of the areas that normally carry the most weight, again, as last time, finance and cash flow, marketing and business development, and client service are the ones that kind of are coming through. People's dropped back a bit. As always, supply chain doesn't get much of a look in. Sustainability doesn't get much of a look in. Public policy and Brexit, that's probably why the polls are doing what they're doing, doesn't get much of a look in. So in terms of, again, these are the top 3 areas that carry the weight. And as we all know, the areas that are discussed at the board meeting and the partner meetings are the ones that actually tend to happen. The ones that don't get the attention probably don't to the same degree of urgency. And then, because we dropped one question, which was around attitudes to going back to the work, because that isn't really relevant anymore at the moment, I asked a question which was from Simon Barrow, which is basically, are people actually walking the talk? Well, 10% said none of these statements are true, which is a bit depressing. Are the leaders sharing strategic ops from the business? Yep, 2/3 roughly. Are employees valued as highly as other stakeholders? About the same, 2/3, 70%. The pain being equally shared, only half the firms that's true for, and that may create ripples for you downstream because people have a habit of asking their friends elsewhere what's going on. Leaders are accessible, 60%. Leaders are transparent, 54%. I mean, I would have thought, and Andrew, I'm sure will have views on this, that those numbers should be a lot higher than 50 and 60%. I would have thought firms that are really, where the leaders are really walking the talk, you'd be looking for 80, 90% doing that. And these, so those are that's the behavioral one that we've looked at. So that's probably a quick run through the poll results, which hopefully you found helpful. We will be sharing those with government in the usual way. And it probably now is my turn to say stop sharing and to invite Andrew to come and give us his thoughts on what he's seen, and in particular governance between and how the board and the CEO can collaborate. And over to you, sir.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you, Richard. Whatever the CEO does, he needs to do it continually. The interface between the board and the management team, between the chair and the CEO, is one of tension. And actually, it is deliberately so, and it is a tension that we need. Because this tension is the tension between oversight, which is a prime function of the board, the governance oversight, and strategy, its creation and delivery, which is the management team. So there is no reason to assume that the two perspectives of the board and the management team should coincide, because the strategy may be going fine, but the board may have ideas to sell the business or to split the business, which may or may not suit the CEO. Now, when we looked at some statistics, and the statistical base is about 19,500 top teams and about 5,000 boards across 43 countries, there were certain interesting trends which had nothing to do with gender, nothing to do with religion, background, country, ethnicity. About 34% of top teams are divided on the mission, strategy, and vision of the organization. And funnily enough, the boards are finding it very difficult to intervene and do something about that. So for over a third of the organizations that we came across, about The life is basically an unwelcome politic that undermines the very fabric of the organization and doesn't seem to go away. The second statistic was when you hear a scandal, when something goes wrong or a merger and acquisition doesn't quite work out, and the statement is made, well, I didn't quite know this was happening. We found that statement to be distinctly not true. 100% of board members and top team members know exactly what's happening. They may not know the details, but the problem is raising an uncomfortable issue. So about 67% of our sample found it very difficult to raise that relevant, uncomfortable issue, and in fact were complicit in slowly allowing the organization to deteriorate. And the third statistic was the board itself. Interestingly enough, when we conducted a study of the FTSE 100, 200, and 300, we found that about 87% of board members did not know, could not tell you, could not agree upon what is the competitive advantage of the firm on whose board they sit. Now, this is serious, because if you have papers put in front of you which basically say, let's buy this power plant in Bucharest or elsewhere, on what criteria are you actually going to accept that particular proposition and go ahead? So when we went to the management, they said, yeah, our board members are not bad, but there was not one management team in the UK that actually could say that what the board says does well, the management think the board does well. The underrating of board performance was about 40% or more. Now, what have we got here? You've got a point of tension. You've got two different opinions. We have two different functions. One is oversight, one is strategy. And those companies that were doing really well had one factor. The chair and the CEO sat together and delineated their roles. So what is the role of the chair with this strategy that we're going to pursue? What is the role of the CEO? And from that debate, which could be an uncomfortable debate because it also brought into the surface the strengths and weaknesses of both those individuals, then came the second debate and said, this is the delineation of roles and duties and responsibilities between the top team and the board. Very much unlike the Cadbury type solution, which is a generic delineation. What we found worked was a dynamic delineation based on context. This company, at this point in time, with this strategy and this chairman and this CEO need to sit and discuss what are they going to do in order to achieve the strategy that they want. This brought to the surface the chemistry factor. What is the chemistry like between the chair and the CEO? And funnily enough, we found that not to be as significant as some of our attendees thought it would be. What was significant was evidence. What is the evidence that the role of the chairman and role of the CEO should be like this, based on this strategy? So a delineation of duties, evidence-driven, which is clear, which is time-framed, it's for the next 3 years, next 5 years, next 2.5 years. That was the basis for improving the relationship between the board and the management team, the chair and the CEO. Thank you.
I think I would describe that as a masterclass. Thank you, Andrew. Brilliant. Very, very helpful. Dan, come and give us your thoughts. By all means, pick up points made by Andrew or focus on a bit more on resilience. That's entirely your call.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everybody. I suspect mine won't be as clear a masterclass as Andrew's just delivered, but nonetheless, let's give it a go. Richard, thank you for the kind introduction. I just wanted to make a couple of points on my background, which will give people a better sense of where I'm coming from. In addition to my time at UK Finance and earlier on at the City UK, where we represented financial and professional services firms, I have spent time, a couple of years, as the COO at Parker Fitzgerald Group, a boutique consulting firm in the risk domain, and I'm currently engaged with a consulting firm in the cyber domain. So hopefully I've got a bit of insight, not just into the financial and financial services, but also into professional services. I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience. That was the brief today. And in preparing my remarks, I thought about resilience in a fairly broad sense. The big gig in town from a financial services perspective, as Richard, as you point out, a highly regulated sector, is operational resilience very specifically, and a consultation going through at the moment. Actually 3 consultations, one from Treasury, one from the PRA and one from the FCA, considering new regulation in order to support firms' ability to be operationally resilient and better serve their customers. That's really important stuff, and the lessons that we've all learned over the last 6 months, whether from within financial services or more further afield, should feed into that consultation. Although I think for the purpose of today, it's probably a little bit too narrow to think about it just in terms of operational resilience. And Richard, actually, to pick up something that you said, resilience for me is much more about strength, and strength is much more about people and the culture within which people work in any particular firm. So I just want to kind of dive into that a little bit. I've thought about 3 interrelated verticals when preparing my comments. The first being the operating platform, including policies, business processes, etc. The second vertical being market engagement, value propositions, and the strategy that firms are following. And the third being this really interesting business of people and culture. And actually, just to reference the poll that you ran, it was really interesting to me that skills and capabilities came out as the second highest in terms of the priorities for your participants today over the forthcoming 12 months or so. That in a sense is really pleasing to hear, because actually that's where I see the key to resilience and potentially the weakness across a number of firms at the moment. But let me take them very briefly in turn. In terms of the operating platform, in 6 months, I think we've learned an awful lot about how we pivot to a virtual working environment, how we adopt new technology platforms. In a regulated sector like financial services, an awful lot of good work done very quickly around things like regulatory reporting. So I don't want to dwell on these things too much. I mean, the evidence of the success of how financial and how the sort of finance and banking industry has pivoted is writ large. In the first couple of weeks post March the 23rd, around 300,000 people working in banking and payments institutions moved to work from home. That went pretty well. There was good continuity of service to customers, reasonably robust continuity of service to employees. I think it surprised everybody at how quickly and how effectively the finance and banking industry pivoted. But, it didn't all go well. There were some issues, particularly around sort of call centre capacity and certain other aspects of customer engagement. And of course, we've all experienced the issues with regard to working from home and the technologies that are available to us. But in terms of those operating platforms, I mean, the work that I did with Director of Operational Resilience at UK Finance really sort of concluded that there were 3 key takeaways around the operating platform. The first was to encourage firms to collaborate and share with their competitors wherever they can. We firmly believe, and I firmly believe, that there isn't necessarily competitive advantage in having a slightly whizzier technology platform versus your competitor firms. It's better to serve the customers of the industry as a whole through collaboration and sharing wherever possible. Second key takeaway was engage your stakeholders very early and at every step. And I think that's reflected in your comments around business development, Richard, if I may. Without fulsome engagement with customers, then the business development piece has stuttered and is stuttering. And therefore, how you then configure your operating platform to deliver those products and services is, of course, constrained. So I think that's a key takeaway. And then I guess related to that, the third key takeaway is a customer-first strategy. This isn't about how do I serve my employees, how do I make sure that I can continue to offer the services that I do. It's about looking at it from the customer perspective, standing outside and looking into your organization when you are configuring your operating platform. So those are my kind of thoughts around that first vertical. In terms of the market engagement and value propositions, look, I agree with so many of the comments that Andrew made around clarity of strategy, clarity of vision, the importance of that tension between a CEO and a chair, or a board more broadly, but actually also the importance of having that very clear and agreed set of roles and responsibilities. And if there is disagreement on strategy, then at least that is clear, articulated and discussed at the appropriate meetings. That much is really, really important. When I look into the 270 plus members of UK Finance very specifically, it's my observation that the firms who put in place the right governance structures and the culture that sits around that, those that have allowed for fast and responsive decision making, those who have focused on innovation and specifically their innovation around their market engagement, and those that have adopted a fail fast approach are the firms that have done best. And I think, as I say, your polling makes very clear that many of you still have significant concerns around business development, and therefore I think that's a critical point to focus on. I want to pull out a couple of examples of specific firms and how they've responded, because I think it begins to make the point around people and culture, and that's the kind of last takeaway that I want to drop into this conversation. So the first organisation that I'm going to touch on is Monzo. I'm sure you've all come across Monzo, one of the new digital challenger banks, not only operating in the UK, but also in the US. Recent news in the last couple of days suggests that Monzo is really struggling, actually, from a profitability perspective. But setting that aside, what's really interesting about Monzo and the approach that Tom Bloomfield takes as the CEO of that organisation is how they innovate and how they make decisions very quickly, working with their board. They'd launched in the US just before the pandemic, and you would have thought that with the disruption the pandemic caused, that might have seen off a fledgling business like Monzo. But actually quite the opposite has happened. Monzo has signed up significant numbers of retail banking customers in the US. During the course of the pandemic, it has also launched a new business account in the US, subscribing 36,000 businesses within a couple of months. And it has also launched a premium banking product in the UK. The net result of all of that was that they've been able to triple their revenues year on year. Now, profitability is challenged, and it's not for me to comment on what the next 6 to 12 months holds for that organisation, but I am firmly of the belief that had they not had that focus on people, culture, governance, etc., and been able to innovate as rapidly, then I think they would be in a significantly worse position right now than they are. Second example, and in many regards my favourite, I'm going to pick on Starling Bank, again, one of the new challenger organisations. I'm sure you've all come across Starling. During the pandemic, Starling just moved at a heck of a pace. It was the first challenger bank to subscribe to the CBILS scheme, which was the treasury scheme administered through the British Business Bank to assist small to medium-sized enterprises in accessing loans to see them through the pandemic. You know, Starling was alongside the major commercial banking providers in leading the charge in not only formulating that scheme, but actually then implementing and supporting SMEs up and down the land. They also, within 6 weeks of the lockdown, launched what they call a connected retail banking service, which was really pointed at people who were sheltering, who couldn't go out of their homes, couldn't shop for basics and essentials, and were reliant on friends and family. The connected card allowed that to happen in a safe and secure way, in a very managed way, by putting the responsibility for all of the financial affairs still with the account holder, but with very clear nominated responsibilities to their friends and families to help them. So again, you know, a fascinating example of how a firm can innovate in a very difficult environment. And they've moved very quickly around their business banking proposition. I'm sure you've all seen the multiple advertising that they're undertaking at the moment to promote their credentials in that space. Now, in my view, that innovation stems directly from Anne Bowden, the CEO of Starling, and the culture that she has set. You know, her focus on agility, on encouraging innovation through pushing responsibility and accountability down management lines. Her focus on diversity and inclusion, I think, has been particularly important. But I think upmost amongst the approaches that she's taken and implemented at Starling is the approach to upskilling staff, which has underpinned that success. You know, ultimately, when I take a little step back and think about the pandemic, you know, I'm not the first person to establish the idea that really what's happening here is that the pandemic is accelerating pre-established trends, and not least of these is the trend in the increased pace of digital innovation. It's worth keeping in mind here that the first law of digital innovation, which is that technology changes quickly, but organizations change much, much more slowly. And so to win, firms need to be on or ahead of the curve. So how do you do that? And how do you do that from a people and culture perspective? Just a couple of comments to round out then. Firstly, firms need to be proactive, not reactive. That seems a very obvious statement, but we are in a world which has been characterized by the need to be reactive over the last 6 months, and actually pivoting to a more proactive approach is difficult. But, you know, it's a leadership challenge, and leaders need to step up to that. The question is really, many firms have changed, but how many have changed well? The second big thing for me is that firms need to empower and upskill their people in these uncertain and fast-changing times. So for me, fine-tuning your firm to be more resilient has to be around focusing on culture and skills. In fact, I'm going to challenge my use of the word skills there, because I'm not sure that that's the right focus. I've been reading quite a little bit at the moment from MIT Sloan Business School, who've done a lot of work into this area, and they propose a shift from thinking about skills to thinking about mindsets and capabilities, and organizing their whole culture and their training and learning and programs around mindsets and capabilities rather than skills. I think that's particularly important. It's important for L&D to be transformative. It's important that chief learning officers are strategic and not operational. We don't know what the world's going to look like in 2 to 5 years, so skilling people up isn't necessarily the obvious thing to do. Giving them the opportunity to adopt new skills on a just-in-time and as-needed basis is absolutely key. So that's where I would argue the focus needs to be in order to improve resilience. And Richard, I can see you're agitated, so I'll pause there.
Dan, not agitated. It was really interesting, and thank you for taking the time. And I thought those case studies were really interesting. I think, both those organizations clearly have CEOs who have decided that doing nothing isn't an option, put it that way. Neville, would you like to come and perhaps share your thoughts? You've obviously heard what Andrew had to say and some examples from Dan. What do you think are the sort of key themes emerging from the conversation today?
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Both excellent presentations, a huge amount of content there, and lots to reflect on and think about. I think in the context of professional service firms, my experience obviously with law firms, I think there's some added complicating factors in terms of the relationship between management and the board, between the managing partner or the CEO and the board. And one of the really difficult areas, I think, is around how all of these people get appointed to those roles. Because in a normal corporate structure, one would typically find a board appointing a CEO, appointing the management, and there's a much clearer line of accountability there, which I think is a helpful basis for then moving on to delineating roles. And one can see how all of that would work effectively if one were able to define the various roles clearly, including with the chair. But where you have a situation where, for example, a managing partner gets elected by the partners, who then potentially appoints board members, or perhaps you have two managing partners, if there's a big global firm, not uncommon, elected by the partners, who then appoint a management committee with a board that's perhaps partly elected, partly appointed by the management. The whole question of accountability, I think, becomes much more confused. And the fact that in firms where the CEO or the managing partner or the senior partners get elected, but people on the board get appointed, I think the prospects of true accountability, and even if delineation is clearly agreed and clear to everybody in the firm, the temptation on the part of the management of the firm to stray outside the agreed role descriptions and feel less accountable for their decisions and for the performance of the organization. I think the risk of that is really high. So I'd be interested in Andrew and others' thoughts on that, and how one applies some of the lessons that Andrew was describing in a professional service firm context.
Before we invite Andrew to respond to that, perhaps Francesca, you'd like to share a few thoughts, and then we'll ask Andrew, give him even more time to reflect on an answer to that question that Neville raised.
Sure, I've got a funny feeling Andrew won't need that long to get some good points together there. But I mean, the CEO board relationship in professional services firms can often be quite a strange dynamic, particularly where you do have almost the person who is doing the appointment, or the person who's most influential, is the person you're reporting to. There can often be a rather intriguing series of problems around governance and around management. I suppose one of the things you see more and more in professional services firms that are of a certain size is the appointment of non-executive people onto the board. And I think that brings a fresh pair of eyes, a robust and helpful challenge to boards who can get a little bit in a loop. They just look at themselves through their own eyes and they don't really think externally. And certainly we've really benefited from non-executives coming on and sharing a different insight, often coming from non-professional services backgrounds as well. So interesting there about, to be good to get Andrew's view on how do you actually shake up some of that group thinking that can go on. And then just picking up on the resilience points, and they were great presentations, by the way. Picking up on the resilience point and the people and culture element of that, I think that is bang on. If I look at everything to do with how successful a business can be, if it's got its culture right and it has an inbuilt resilience element to it, it tends to ride out whatever life throws at it, be it COVID, be it whatever the market's got going on. And that focus on culture has become such an important part of how successful businesses are working. And in the many years ago, it was thought to be a soft thing. And now people realize it's not only a core thing, it's also a really hard thing to get right. So a huge amount around resilience of people themselves, but also resilience of the business is tied up with how your culture is set up. So I'll stop there, Richard, so we can give a chance to people to come back and take any questions.
Andrew, your thoughts would be interesting on particularly Neville's one around there's this additional element around accountability.
Thank you, Neville's and Francesca's. When we look at professional services firms, the delineation, when I've worked with certain professional services firms, if done well, and we have a positive chair and a positive CEO, and there is a distinct understanding concerning the competitive advantage of this firm, we can get that delineation. But we also have these professional relationships that Neville was talking about. So what happens is that the stewardship side to the governance role is accentuated. It's almost like working in some of these agricultural cooperatives, say in Ireland, which led to the success years ago of Kerry Gold. There were 17 people on the board, and they were elected, and yet we had a global product that worked really well. So when the stewardship side kicks in, we now have a sensitivity. And when that stewardship side is enacted by people who really don't share that sense of mission and purpose, don't share that view on culture, we can get that looseness of accountabilities that Neville was talking about. However, you will find the same in corporate firms. And the difficulty is for any board member is to get that balance between compliance and stewardship. Now, I also have to say that tension is there. So it's not a matter of trying to have a formula. What I have found is each tension, each relationship, each circumstance is unique. And I do recall one very famous chairman, Sir John Parker, basically said, when I go onto a new board, BINED or chair, I have to forget everything I've learned in the past, because I have to get so into this particular culture to understand what's happening. And perhaps the final point, when you get that diffusion of accountabilities and some of the irritations beneath the surface, and Dan's point about vulnerabilities and resilience, it is the board's role, and we found in the most successful companies in the world, it is the board's role to own the culture. It's the management's role to own the strategy, but it's the board's role to own the culture. And that means that the board has devolved a system with the management of knowing how to intervene and understand and get evidence on the ground so that they can bring that debate to the boardroom. No, not many boards have done that. Not many chairs have tried to challenge their CEOs to do that. And that particular point of delineation concerning not just roles and responsibility, but who owns what. And there are only two real things to own, the strategy and the culture. When the board owns the culture, some of the issues that we have heard so far probably are minimized. Can't say eradicated, but minimized.
Dan, a chance for you to come back and share your thoughts in terms of where the conversation is taking us.
Yeah, no, look, I'm really taken by those final comments that Richard that Andrew has just made in respect of ownership of culture, because I tend to agree. I think, the sort of well-worn maxim that a CEO owns the culture and culture is set from the top and communicated down team lines, management lines, etc. I've never fully subscribed to that, and I certainly don't see that as working effectively in this wonderfully strange virtual and hybrid world within which we now live. So I do think that it's a board set agenda. How then culture gets implemented and sort of infiltrated, if you like, across the organization is particularly key. And one of the things that I think about in that respect is trying to engineer culture by pushing it down traditional management lines is not working well in the firms that I have spoken to, not least because the cross-fertilization, colleagues talking to other colleagues outside of their normal team orbit, if you like, is just not happening as much as it would do if you're in the office and bumping into people. So that kind of setting and promulgating of culture, and a culture that is appropriate for agility, for innovation, leading to resilience, is actually quite difficult to achieve. So I think the challenge, Andrew is absolutely right. Culture is owned by the board. How that then gets defined and promulgated across the business, I think is a real challenge.
Neville, you're part of a firm which has, of a recent merger, a big US firm met a large UK firm. Both brought their inverted commas cultures plural to the conversation, I suspect. Is it realistic to think about having a firm having one culture, or do you think you have to actually accommodate multiple cultures? And if so, what implications do you think that has?
Wow, what an interesting question. And I assume, Richard, you're extending the seminar by an hour so we can discuss that question fully. I think any international organization, almost by definition, has to be able to accommodate multiple cultures, because no matter how strong one tries to inculcate an organizational corporate culture, different countries, different cities within countries even will always have quite a strong element of local culture. And I think one can't ignore that, certainly can't eliminate it. So I think the key, what we did in our firm, and I see this in many other international organizations, is the key is to work out some common values, which can't only come from the top. There needs to be an exercise where people throughout the organization are engaged, an opportunity for people to understand and discuss and feel involved in the development of some genuine, meaningful values which are common across the organization, which people can subscribe to, which help define the purpose of the organization and the things that are really important. And then I think if one can get clarity on those, and if there's a genuine commitment on the part of the leadership of the firm, firstly, of course, to be good role models for those values, absolutely essential, otherwise the exercise is pointless. And secondly, to ensure that wherever possible those values are reinforced, that they acquire meaning within the organization, then I think that provides the basis of a common culture to develop and emerge and strengthen over time, while at the same time leaving the flexibility for local cultures, even within the same office. I find in my firm, London is the biggest office, and even within different practice areas, there are slightly different cultures, different ways of working, different ways of engaging with clients. And I think that flexibility is healthy as long as there's sort of a clear common understanding of the fundamentals.
Wonderful response. Thanks, Neville. Francesca, you also work obviously in an organization with multiple cultures, and the relationship possibly in the accountancy firm being more fluid maybe than the law firm in terms of particularly post Enron and the rest, when all the accountancy firms suddenly became sole traders. What's your take on where this conversation has taken us today?
I mean, I'd amplify a lot of what Neville just mentioned there, because I think there's one piece around the culture of a country. I mean, we work in 130 different territories, and there's such different cultures. The respect you have for the culture of each territory is hugely important. Organising a meeting in Japan is very different to organising a meeting in the US. And you have to understand that to have a successful meeting, both with your own people, never mind with clients. But I think it is that underlying culture of a business that's hugely important. And it doesn't matter if you're one office sitting in one country or 700 offices scattered around the world. You need an underlying piece, and that's often is the value-driven element. And it may be that the values are something that is so ingrained in the culture of the firm that they are so much part of the DNA. That's the kind of business that tends to thrive, and they're not just something that gets stuck on a wall and everyone forgets about it. They're something that are really true. And you tend to find with organizations that people get attracted and succeed in an organization where their values resonate. So they not only respond to them and they're attracted to join a firm because of them, but they see that lived out day in and day out. And there was a question around, is that something that needs to be driven through the HR department? Do they have that proximity to power to enable that to happen? I think it has to happen a much broader range than that. HR have a hugely important part to play, and I mean HR not just in the operational sense, but in how they drive people and culture. But actually, it needs everybody to embrace the culture for it to be truly successful.
Yeah, and one of the things I always think quite interesting, I mean, let's say take accountancy where a small percentage, maybe 5-6% of the people who join the firm will make it to partners. So you have a 90% plus people who will leave before in the first 15 years. And yet the culture remains rock solid despite levels of turnover, which times are probably higher than many other industries. Andrew, I'd love your thoughts on, am I taking people in terms of multiple cultures and values? Is this straying in your mind, or do you think this adds to the conversation?
It very much adds to the conversation. Thank you, Richard. Reality is every organization has multiple cultures, and the more different locations and product streams and service streams you have, hence the cultures. Hence the need for the board to really understand what is the blend and tension between those cultures that are there. And for that, the board members need to fundamentally leave the boardroom. And they need to be able to go to different locations, to be able to understand what's happening, to gather evidence, and to report that transparently and with resilience to the boardroom. That is vital for one very simple reason. Dan gave us an amazing insight about resilience. But when it's not there, when resilience is declining and vulnerability begins to creep in, people know that more than they know resilience, because they know what they're living. They can see the impact of a vulnerable organization on them, their lives, their futures, their incomes. That is rich data. And that is the data that has to go to the boardroom. Why do we have organizations with declining resilience? It's because the cultural issues are not being addressed. And Dan was quite right to indicate that this top-down view of driving the culture, making things happen, is not a good model. Because repeatedly what we find is the same problems known for quite some time are occurring and reoccurring. And one of the comments I hear is, in all of the problems we've got, we know the management are responsible, but where's the board? The board is absent. Now, whether the board is there or not, in the minds of the people I talk to, it is absent. So it emphasizes the need that there has to be an oversight of the organization, not just in terms of finances, competitive advantage, and business, but in the reality of how the conduct of life and work is undertaken in the organization. And your figures, Richard, which indicated is the leadership in touch, the sort of 54% and 61%, I'm actually surprised the figures are so high, because I'm seeing right now with digital AI coming in, technology, actually tremendous benefit, giving data to the board, but he does not give data to the board on the reality of how business is conducted and where the problems are and why they're not being addressed. So with developments, with COVID, with new technologies, I'm seeing compliance overemphasized and regretfully stewardship even more undermined.
Fascinating. Maybe our sector is different. I suppose if your leader is isolated, your middle management are isolated, and your frontline are isolated, unless you're starting to build those key communication channels between them. Clients have a habit of noticing, I suppose. And the one thing I've always found in professional services is that if it's important to the clients, it gets done. If it's seen as an internal matter, it's given a lower priority. We've got a couple of minutes left now. Maybe Francesca, can you want to sort of wrap up with your final thoughts? That would be really helpful. And thank you all to the panel for your contributions today. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm sorry I threw you a fastball, Neville, but I thought you handled it brilliantly.
Well, I get a chance to have a final say, which is always lovely. I think I just want to reference the question we have about the quality of leadership and how that drives through the management board. And I think that sort of ties up quite nicely here. I think all the points that Andrew's made are really about people having the right conversations in the right way, and around how you can drive that through and the resilience of your business. So what it points to is that investment within leadership, doesn't it? How do you make sure that your business survives and thrives and does all the things it should do? It's about making sure you're investing in the leadership you have at this current moment in time, around the investment in the leadership that you're bringing in, be that external or internal, and how important it is. Because if you aren't able to have those really mature conversations at the top level, and you aren't able to really recognize the need for resilience right through into your culture, you're leaving yourself at a big disadvantage. So a huge plug there for the value of strong leadership and thoughtful investment in leadership as well.
Well, thanks very much for that. I can't really add anything other than to say that unfortunately we've come to an end. As Neville said, it would have been lovely. We could have gone discussing cultures and mindsets. We didn't really even get into Carol Dweck's territory, but that's a really fascinating area as well. The role of HR. There's just been so much great stuff that's been covered today. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Neville. Thank you, Andrew. Really great conversations. And whilst we managed to solve the issues, I always like to think this session is great at identifying some of the elephant traps that possibly firms should be looking to avoid, and hopefully some of the ideas we've been sharing will help you in your firms avoid those elephant traps. You'll fall into some little ones maybe, but the big ones are the ones you obviously really want to try and avoid. As you know, next week, early next week, the recording of today's show will be available in the Management Library. So it only really remains to me to say I hope you found today valuable. And please encourage your peers to come and join us. It's a free show, public good. We love doing it. 26 weeks in, already booking great people in for November now. So thank you to Neville and thank you to everybody else. And it's been a great session, and bye for now.